Hi, I'm Mark Lux, Extension Wheat Scientist with Ohio State University. Today I'm presenting some reminders about fall herbicide applications. You still have a lot of time this fall to make applications. Typically we've done it up almost until Christmas and certainly through early December. We think early to mid-November is always a good time. We don't get too concerned about freezing temperatures here and there, but if you hit like a spot of very cold, continued freezing weather that we occasionally get around November and you start to see dandelion turn purple and things like that, you might want to consider cutting that off. You know, the whole thing about fall herbicide applications is they create this very winter-free annual and dandelion-free, a lot of the time, seed bed in the spring that just makes everything way easier. So if you're looking at a situation like this that I'm standing in, which is at the farm near campus, you see a lot of weeds here, right? So this is a type of situation where you've got dandelion, and dandelion likes to have its life cycle interrupted several times a year for best control. We're hearing complaints about dandelion control where people have decided they don't need fall herbicide applications. So dandelion is just much easier to control in the fall at any other time. And if you do a follow-up, you know, next year with one of the effective soybean systems, that's an effective way to do that. We don't get too hung up on, in a lot of cases, what the other weeds are, because, you know, we recommend a program that we know just works across a pretty broad variety of weeds. You got mustards out here, something in the mustards family that, you know, can be hard to identify this time of year, you know, something like that. You got chickweed, you got dead nettle, so it's a little bit of a typical representation here. You know, and the benefit of the fall herbicide application is that if you get into a situation like we got into this past year where it was really wet and people couldn't get in at certain times, and you have not done a fall herbicide application, all this stuff here is going to create a big kind of mess you have to deal with in the spring. And when your burn down gets delayed, you know, that gets very challenging. So, you know, the idea is I can do a fall herbicide application for not a lot of money. We recommend keeping the cost pretty low, take pretty much all this stuff out, get a leg up on dandelion and thistle and some other species, and create a situation that's just much more manageable in the spring. You know, in addition to, you know, fall herbicide application being a key control step for controlling mare's tail. We typically recommend something like a 2,4-D plus glyphosate, or 2,4-D plus dicamba, or an ALS inhibitor like Canopy if you're going to beans, or a basis type product, or one of those generic products. You can do 2,4-D Princep going to corn and things like that. For our money, we like the 2,4-D glyphosate just because it's pretty cheap and it seems to work as well as anything, along with the 2,4-D Canopy. The 2,4-D dicamba for us can be a little bit less effective on the lower rates on dead nettle and a couple other weeds, dicamba not being a great cold weather herbicide. Having said that, it's very good on mare's tail, and we generally don't get into arguments about which one to use as long as we think you're using something that, you know, is really pretty effective across the board. One of the questions we get is about corn fodder and harvesting corn and coming in with fall herbicide applications. And fall herbicide applications typically have, I think they're most valued going to beans, where we struggle to control dandelion in some cases, and also mare's tail. And it's, you know, it's been kind of amazing to us, but we just typically go ahead and spray in the corn fodder and really don't worry about it that much. You certainly have time to let it kind of sit down and let the winter annuals emerge through it to some extent. As I said, you've got another, what we typically consider, a month of good weather to do that. We advocate keeping the cost pretty low, and one of the ways to do that is really not use residual herbicides in your programs, in your fall herbicide programs. They peter out over the fall. They don't give you a lot of value going into the spring, and, you know, your residual herbicides applied at planting or just before in the spring really have a lot more value that applied in the fall. So we generally across the board don't recommend that, with the exception that if you can use a lower rate of Canopy X or Canopy DF or something like that for not a lot of cost with a 2,4-D, you can, you know, that's one way to do that and get some pretty considerable residual into the spring. One weed I want to make sure I mention is bluegrass, because we're getting a lot of questions about annual bluegrass and having difficulty controlling that in the spring with glyphosate and other herbicides, especially probably when it's cold to some extent. So annual bluegrass fall is a very good time to go after that, and that is a type of situation where you're going to want glyphosate in there. So if you're doing a 2,4-D dicamba, that would be the time to add glyphosate, or a 2,4-D Canopy or something like that. Some glyphosate in there can really go a long way. So we have other resources available for you. The newsletter that's coming out the week I'm making this video will have a link to a winter annual ID PowerPoint and a video and some other resources for you. There's some basic components to fall herbicide applications, and as long as you follow those and don't spend too much, it's just a really good addition to programs to kind of keep everything under control over time.